All right, I don't think we're live yet. I think we'll be live in just a second here. Okay. All right, the light is red. Hey, everybody. We're on an off day. I'm trying to do more of those. This is SMQ, and we have Buster 1978 here as my guest, and I appreciate everybody in the chat showing up here. Thank you, Lisa W, Jason, and Mishka the cat. Thank you so much, and everybody else that's out there watching and not saying anything. Thank you so much for being here. So, Buster, I went ahead and I sent out all of the documents that you found with the CIA, and it took me a long time to really, again, absorb. The only thing this time is I had a kind of frame of reference with the original document. So everybody that's listening to this live, and then everybody that will listen to this later, all of the documents, the whole document dump is included in the description here. All the documents are CIA FOIA requests. However, they're completely legal, and they're well over, again, 30 years old. So you don't run the risk, and you're going to CIA.gov, and it's a PDF that's completely safe. So, I guess we should just go ahead and get started. These documents, they kind of build off the gateway process, and we can spring forth a lot of things that I kind of speculated on. They verified some of those things, and then they also made me start to think about those particular elements that I kind of speculated on in new ways, and they sort of fortified the ways I thought about some of the things that I speculated about. So, Buster, what's your immediate takeaway and your immediate thoughts?
My immediate thoughts are basically, it seems right after Monroe published his book in 1971. 1971, I think he created the Monroe Institute not long after that. And it seems like the Army got interested in about 1978. So it took about 7 or 8 years for the Army to get interested in his work. And not long after 1978, they kind of started, it looks like around 1981, maybe 1982. And then I think the analysis of the gateway process was 1983, if I'm not mistaken. And then that kind of program kind of continued from there into the mid 80s and late 80s. But the documents seem to trail off after that. So it's kind of hard to figure out what progressed after the gateway program. But it seems that it didn't take too long for them to be really interested in what he was doing and the practical applications of what they could achieve with what he was, the techniques that he was using.
Yeah, exactly. And that was great that you started with that, because that's probably one of the things we could start with is what I really wanted to. One of the things I talked about before is this kind of a birth of a technology. And oftentimes a technology can be, something that's real, like hardware. It could be something that's more ethereal, like a software, or it could be a process like, project management or something like that. And in this case, this was this more or less a kind of meditative exercise that would, as we talked about in the original CIA document, would help you sort of escape the confines of this hologram that we call existence, and more or less be able to time travel and just sort of move around without detection. And all of that is, at this point, I think I've covered it ad nauseum. And if you're new to the channel by this point, my only advice would be to go to the half a dozen or so videos that's, since I've started to cover this. And I really wanted to move on to new material. But the still the most important aspect from the original documents from June 9th, 1983 was sort of, I thought, was the birth of that particular technology. But really what we're looking at with some of the documents that you had here, where they actually had the conclusions already drawn as early as June 1982, where it says here, conclusion, the Gateway Program as presented by the MIAS, which obviously is Monroe Institute, is of significant value to the U.S. Army Girl Flame operation, and provided certain conditions are met, these conditions are, and then it goes into those conditions. And
Yeah.
basically, what we're really looking at is we're looking at sort of the genesis of a technology, and that's what I was really interested in, and what I try to concentrate on, and what I talk about is the genesis of where technologies come from. And oftentimes we have this idea that it's these people in lab coats, or it's people coding or something like that. And before this particular technology was codified, and it looks like it was dispersed throughout various aspects of the DoD. We're talking about, the Monroe Institute, which sounds more or less like an independent organization dealing with sort of these aspects of semi-occult, semi-paranormal, kind of mental telepathy, that range and that sort of sphere of thinking. So it kind of reinforces what I was already saying about the timeline of a particular technology, where it's taken down and then it's distributed, throughout the armed forces, and then from the armed forces, eventually there's usually given an aspect that's given over to the private sector, to private fund. Although I don't see beyond the explosion of of sort of the do-it-yourself pop psychology side. I suppose perhaps that's a derivative of what we're reading here from 30 plus years ago. Like I do the practices of the power of now, but beyond that, I don't really see anything yet coming out like we had with DARPA and the internet and things like that. But you know, it's pretty interesting that all of these particular documents do indeed, if you read through them and you look in the right way, they do tell you exactly how a technology is discovered, how a technology is made into a process, and then it's distributed for clandestine and military action. But it doesn't start in a laboratory. It doesn't start in a barracks. It starts in these places that you just don't expect. At least I didn't. So what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So people who might not be familiar with Robert Monroe, it says in one of the documents that in 1958, he was a broadcasting executive, and he began having experiences that drastically altered his life. Like, this is straight from the document I'm just reading. Unpredictably and without willing it, altered his life. So Monroe found himself leaving his physical body to travel via a second body to locales far removed from the physical and spiritual realities of life. He was inhabiting a place unbounded by time or space. So that just gives an idea of some of the stuff that he was going through. And it seems like he had a difficult time trying to put down his experiences. So that's why he wrote the book Journeys Out of the Body in 1971. And it seems like after that, it kind of became very popular. And I think that's when the Army kind of noticed the work that he was doing, and then he got involved with the Army.
So, and again, we're talking about something, a technique, a technology, whatever you want to call it, that the Army eventually we see, even though it trailed off, which tells me that it says a couple things to me, that the technology then advanced to where they are unable or unwilling to release it to the public, whatever realms that it went to, which is sort of like I think of like the way this technology is being used would be like the Minority Report, and using it for either pre-crime or being able to kind of detect things on the world stage before they happen, or influence things on the world stage, or in federal law enforcement.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I'm thinking. What happened was, or you could go as far as like the Alex Jones idea, where eventually they used that as well as other technologies, both in terms of pharmaceutical and otherwise. Uh, and it grew to a point to where these other versions, these holograms that you are essentially clicking out of, and the entities that they talk about, even in this DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, The documents they talk about as early as 19 or as late as 1985. They talk about these intelligences, how to deal with them, and perhaps there is a kind of circular pattern to all this. Perhaps it was these intelligences that eventually took Mr. Monroe. um, you know, they kind of transferred some of these intelligences to him in order for him to have these experiences, so he could be the conduit from which these particular technologies were or techniques were distributed. And now, again, like I said with the blockchain, you have something that is in another realm, like the blockchain with a distributed kind of galactic ledger in another realm. And then you have it being mirrored in this realm. And once it's mirrored in this realm, you have a deeper connection with other realms and other versions of reality. Now, if this sounds far-fetched or too new agey and you haven't read the document, I urge you, please, please, please read the document 9 June 1983, Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. It goes on to explain the holographic universe and the entities that exist within this holographic universe. So my point about technology and my point about how you described very accurately exactly what Mr. Monroe went through was perhaps this process that technology is kind of a deeper with each sort of stroke of the pen, if you were, we have a deeper and deeper bind to this other ethereal plane. Certainly once the world became more electric, there is all kinds of references, like in the Book of Enoch, and there's just disparate occult references everywhere talking about electricity and the way it's used and how it's been used before in the past in other technologies. You've got references, obviously, ad nauseum as well, to the pyramids and to earlier technologies that have perhaps been erased or forgotten, that spills over into flamenco. All of it eventually comes together, and all of it eventually becomes a broader pattern that you can, almost do like that conspiracy person where you have cutouts of and string drawn to each of the newspaper clippings and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like the way that this progressed is that they've sort of found out that there was different levels to this gateway process. So
Yes.
they even broke it down into specific, saying, okay, there's a certain level called that we're going to call it focus 10. And that focus 10 is this thing which basically is your kind of mind's almost like in a hypnotic trance almost. And they're saying here, right from the document, it's saying individuals find themselves thinking more with images than with words. Though we all do this in the dream state, few non-visualizers have achieved that level of relaxation that permits them to do it in the waking state. They find it a peculiar experience. Strong energies can flow in focus 10. Energies similar to electrical or vibratory sensation. We call them non-physical energies. To establish more control in this state, the next series of exercises concentrate on building and using a very simple imaginary tools for gathering, focusing, and distributing these non-physical energies. So it's talking about interacting with non-physical energies. And you could take that literally, or you could take that abstractly, or you could apply it to whatever else you might think they're doing in that state of mind. But they've even developed that level even further. So they're talking about this focus 12, which is like a higher version of focus 10. And then there's even a state beyond that that's called focus 15, where it's like this state where they're able to kind of be in and out of time, or even have the ability to manipulate time.
Yeah, can you expound on that focus 15, because they said not everybody can do that now, and this sort of goes into this more or less the what people would think about if you're in the more conspiratorial state of mind, the occult and the not everybody is invited, so to speak, into the ancient Pythagorean mystery schools, and that would be perhaps those that alludes to that kind of mental ability. So you would be invited, so to speak, to that sort of that kind of mystery school state of mind if you could get to focus 15. What are your thoughts on all that?
So, in the document for the analysis and the assessment of the Gateway program, there's that beginning part where they're talking about using your focus, like they use the analogy of a lamp to a laser. So, it seems like that's what this progression is talking about. There's this state called focus 10, focus 12, focus 15. And in each state, it's either a higher form of energy or it's like the light is kind of being focused into one area. And yeah, they did say focus 15 is something which not many people can achieve. Apparently, it's a very small number of people that can actually get to that level. In one of the documents, they say focus 15, much as focus 12 appears to rise naturally out of focus 10, the state we call focus 15 grows naturally out of a strong and stable focus 12. Yet a different energy level, focus 15, leads into a different set of energy systems, marked most of all by the non-significance of time. In fact, time as we know it no longer exists. Our explorers have reported that in one area of focus 15, they have some ability to manipulate time.
Yeah, and that's something that I would like to kind of, I would like to say as humbly as I can. It's sort of one of those things that I just inherently knew without the DoD sort of explicitly saying it, and that there is no time. And I was talking about a few months ago this idea of superposition, and I was talking about this reality, and this is before I had these documents. This reality being kind of flat, and there can be this state of superposition where you can go above it, and it's just something I was thinking of and seeing that that's possible.
Yeah,
And
and I think in the original document, the analysis and assessment, I think that's what they're referring to when they're talking about clicking out,
yep, that's
where the
superposition. Yeah,
yes, yes.
right. And that was what I was trying to do, was trying to essentially get these documents to me without knowing it, I guess. But anyway, so let's just jump back real quick with what you were talking about with the intelligences. I think the thing about the intelligences is that this is, you've got to remember, this is the army. I think they're being literal. Um, Now I know that could potentially put me in the kook category, but I'm going to be, I'm going to, especially in light of recent interactions I've had, I'm assuming I'm already there anyway. So that kind of frees me to stay within the kook realm. And I'm going to assume that within all of these documents, that they're being quite literal when they speak of non-corporeal intelligences or intelligences not of this version of reality. That's my safe assumption, is that they're being quite literal because it's the DoD, it's the Army, it's the 1980s. It's all of those things put together, that I'm thinking that it's literally those things that, and I'm thinking when the documents had finally dropped off, I don't think that they did drop off. I think they dropped off for us. I think the technology has extended, and I think the technology has vastly grown. And I think that you can see just quips and bits and tiny pieces come out every now and then about it. And I think, again, once again, the role of fiction is incredibly important, and you need to pay attention to the role of fiction, because one of the central things that I think about fiction is it first develops, and it says in here, actually, in the original document from June 9, 83, it talks about the role of the brain and the way in which it works and the way it kind of organizes things, and also the role of vocabulary, the role of language. So what fiction gives for us, like Parsons back in the early 20th century, what was so important with that situation was, at the time, there was a basis from science fiction that people could, one, help visualize and thus help with their energy to concentrate on this plane of existence, to help visualize taking from that realm. I called it the muse, and I don't call it that anymore because I see it clearly now. It's more like a It's more like this fractal holographic pattern you pull down from something that may be a bit different on another side of the ledger to our side of the ledger. How you do that is first you install the language and then you install the visuals on top of the language. Once that's done, you've prepped the public for the new technology to come into being. And then after that happens, then the technology is realized by somebody. And for me, it doesn't, at least from the 80s, the realization of the technology, I used to think it had to be by the person who summoned it, like a Parsons. But it seems to me with Monroe, I have to alter my idea of how technology is created in that it can just come to someone. And perhaps our society was ready for it, meaning human society. This version of existence was ready for it. And he just happened to have been the conduit to take it. And perhaps there's a certain number of variables or check boxes that made it so it was Monroe, that he was able to handle it and that he was able to quantify it and he was able to stabilize it and put it into a form that was easily digestible and to where it showed enough results that it piqued the interest of, the DoD. So that's what I think how technology comes into being. I don't think that there's anything about technology that I think there has to be a lot of prep in terms of imagination and a lot of prep that we don't even understand. However, I think from things that I'm sensing and feeling and things that I see, I think that is too has changed because you talk about Focus 15, there could be Focus. And obviously, I bet the population gets further narrowed as you go to maybe a Focus 25 or a Focus 100 or a Focus 1000. The power, grows incredibly as well as the focus grows. And I think that there comes a point where people perhaps can, rather than technology being just delivered to them at random, perhaps we can now even control the flow from the other side of the hologram into this oscillating, paradigm of a hologram or whatever.
Yeah, it does seem to be that's how it works. They don't go into too much detail about what actually is taking place when you're in these altered states of consciousness. I think they even mention it in one of the documents where they're saying they're not exactly sure why it works, but they know that it does work. Like when you enter into the altered states, your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere are in sync, and that produces this altered state, but they don't know exactly why it works. But it does seem to be that it's directly interacting with this holographic reality, allowing you to perceive realities outside of normal existence.
And that's the thing too. I think that I bet there was some sort of there was something maybe not released or in another document or another memo that perhaps the way that I think about the DoD, my dad was in the Navy. Um, all of my uncles were in the Navy. My grandfather was in the military. As far back as I know, I come from very other than my sister and myself and this generation of children, a lot of us didn't go into the service, but we come from a very service-oriented background. And I can tell you the state of mind of military people is a bit of like the Missouri Show Me thing. You gotta. I hope I got that state right, and if I didn't, I do apologize to anyone in that state. But it's sort of a show me kind of thing. So there had to have been at least one person to go before they bothered to even write up a document because of the resource constraints to write up a document like this where someone had come back that they trusted and said, yeah, this thing works. And there had to have been some kind of exchange where it was revealed that this is the first representative of the DoD and said, look, we want something that is concrete that will be shown to us. And I believed that exchange, whether it was through technology, whether it was something as simple as we're asking you to have an event happen, at these coordinates, or something as simple happen as something show up out of nowhere, or I don't know what. I'm just making these things up, but something to happen to make sure that even the most hardened, highest brass within, all the way up to the Joint Chiefs, that they knew, okay, this is for real. And we don't know why, but this is for real. And obviously the role of the DoD to explore all of those things, to maintain control of all of those things. So that's what I think happened.
Yeah, and like you said before, it's hard to figure out what happened later on in the 1980s because there's the documents do seem to trail off after that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this program ceased to exist. It could have just been moved elsewhere, or they could have done further research on it by some other means.
Right, exactly. I totally agree. Hey, everybody in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm not ignoring, and I just saw that someone was just saying hi, and it had a I had to let me scroll through to make sure no one is being okay, cool. So sorry about that, Buster. I had to I we're kind of winging this thing here. So what else are your takeaways? I mean, what are you thinking here? I mean, we're talking about, I mean, this thing obviously is in place. And if we had to speculate after the 80s and the way that it was implemented, I mean, what are you thinking? How far is this thing gone now?
Yeah, the Focus 15 part seems to be the kind of main thing that probably would have interested the Army in that. I mean, the Focus 10 is one thing, the Focus 12 seems to be another. They all seem to be dealing with the person or the individual themselves, getting them to work with what they call non physical energies. Focus 12 being like an enhanced version of Focus 10, and then this Focus 15 seems to be being able to move outside of time or even being able to manipulate time to a certain extent. Now, if
Yeah.
I was someone in the Army and I'd heard someone come up with a claim like that, my attention would be immediately drawn to that, saying, what applications can we use that for? Is it possible to do this or that? There's so many different things you could go with that. I mean,
What
Focus
about
15 is definitely the kind of like the main holy grail as to what this program is basically capable of doing.
right? And I made the speculation before, being able to not only traverse time in a nonlinear fashion, but to be able to, in a lot of ways, drop in and out of these different, time zones. A new way to use time zones, I guess. You know, do you think? I mean, I'm thinking it was awfully strange. There was a lot going on. It was very chaotic right about the time that these things were happening, and suddenly, at least in American society, there was this massive shift in terms of um, like the levels of violence and all these other things that had happened. Do you think perhaps this kind of technology may have been used even without, maybe with the knowledge of, I don't know, maybe not local law enforcement, but maybe statewide law enforcement, or maybe just the FBI? They kept it within the feds. Do you think I think it's possible. Do you think it's possible that they could have implemented this in a more domestic way and it left the sort of confines of the DoD, or do you think something like this is far too sensitive?
I think definitely they could have used that to whatever extent they felt necessary. Now, that could be in a localized sense, that could be on a national sense, or it could be on some kind of global sense. I also read in some other documents that they hired outside sources, like what they would call known psychics, or people who were already into this sort of thing at the time. So people who are already into meditation and being in some kind of altered form of consciousness. So they
Yeah.
would kind of contract these people out for a period of time, get them to do certain remote viewing sessions, and then perhaps even going into this Focus 15 state to either peer into the future or the past or whatever it was that they wanted to achieve at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah, see, I didn't think I was that far out, and after I read the other documents you sent out and the way that it was being sort of carried out, that they didn't drop it. They I think it's fair to say they really ran with this program. But I think, yeah, I think it's massive, and I think that I underlined a bunch of different things here, and I've got this note here. I love this. Oh, They use it for efforts of detecting and assessing hostile technological capabilities in specific locations. And what I love is the wordplay there. First off, hostile technological capabilities. Well, after if you read the original document, that doesn't necessarily mean human technologies and human capabilities. That's one. Two, specific locations doesn't necessarily mean Earth, or at least this version of Earth. So,
Absolutely. I mean,
absolutely. Go ahead, please.
it might not be too far out to conceive the fact that if you were to send a probe into outer space to a planet, you would try to come up with a plan, and you'd come up with a dollar amount to it and the amount of time it would take to do that. Or you could consider the possibility of hiring somebody for a remote viewing session and saying, "Okay, we would like you to see if there's something on this planet." Now, is that possible? I mean, that's up for the audience to decide whether that's possible or not, but it does seem plausible.
Okay, so let's go real far for a second here at the risk of losing everybody. But going back to that original document, and I like to go back to that hologram, and they talk about the hologram, and I'm now thinking of the way in which the occult always uses the fractal imagery, the kaleidoscope kind of imagery. I absolutely have seen that imagery myself in my dreams and other places. It absolutely now makes sense in terms of a counter existence that isn't exactly a doppelganger, but is a close second to that. Different journal entries. But if you were to freeze that and shatter that, like they were talking about, and you had that fractal, and that fractal still somewhat had an image or a reflection of the whole, sort of the galactic ledger. I like saying, what would that be something? Would that be something that they would be willing to do in order to experiment on? And going even farther than that, are we part of that experiment? And going one more node out, to take terminology from the blockchain, are we in fact, the Mandela effect is a side effect of there being a fractal that is too small, that is trying to maintain all of all of the imagery and all of the everything, the processing, all of the memory, everything within the larger ledger, trying to be held within a smaller processing unit that just cannot hold it. What do you think?
It's definitely possible. It's hard to say whether or not that is actually the case. For me, I can definitely see that there's examples everywhere if you look hard enough of reality being a fractal. So, like the other day, I posted on Twitter about this new technology that's coming out with this interactive holographic technology where you can interact with these holograms through this thing called HoloLens 2.
Yep.
And there's persons basically just touching and moving around these holograms like it's nothing. So we have these holograms that you can interact with, and this DoD document that's saying reality itself is a hologram. Well, there is basically a fractalized version of a hologram inside another hologram. So who knows if things are nested with inside another nest? It
Right.
could be.
I think it would go long in the document. Why, for people who are listening, and for people who may listen, I think it would be really powerful for you to read that document, because it truly, you get so much from it. It explains so much. It also, it props up a lot of things. I think that the Mandela effect is perhaps something that is, it's more or less the edges have become fuzzy from a fractal that has perhaps been broken off. And in some ways, um, I know for some reason, right after all this, and you and I spoke about it, we started to get flooded with these DMT videos.
Yes.
And perhaps that was a Joe Rogan thing because of the him and the Alex Jones thing. But I was flooded, so I naturally, I'm curious, because I've never taken DMT, or I steer away from anything like that. But
It's funny you should say that because in the document they actually mention something similar to that, but they kind of showed the difference between it. So And on one of the documents, they're saying right here, the full scope of hemisync consciousness is yet to be determined. Very little is known of its characteristics, value, or utility other than the preliminary work performed by the Institute. There is a growing belief that meditation, moments of crisis, certain mental disciplines, intense concentration, peak experiences, all represent varieties of such consciousness. Conversely, hypnosis, drug-induced states, illness, and anesthesia and like conditions do not. So it's
Exactly.
saying that this form of altered consciousness is not similar to what people have been talking about, these DM trips where people see these, machine elves.
Exactly. So, and that's interesting. They said that about, for me, I became, or at least I changed. And I don't know if you knew or you listened to that video. I had a lot of people die in my family at one time in 2016. In the from about April to summer of 2016, I had 3 people pass away in my family in a very rapid succession, and one of them violently. And whenever it was over, it was the fall of 2016 is whenever I noticed the Mandela effect. Like, I noticed the world had changed. And it's interesting that it was that kind of stress, that incredible amount of stress in a very condensed period of time that was relatively ho hum before that, and it's never been the same since. So that is very interesting. And I've heard now, going through different occult literature, paranormal literature, as well as listening to testimonies, that a lot of people do exactly what you're talking about in order to speak with uh, entities, spirits, deities, whatever it may be. It's kind of this primordial smack to the head, so to speak, to really change, your focus, and to really kind of shake you up in a way. And that's very interesting. And I hear a lot of people talk about a huge portion of the ME community being people who had gone through experiences of like NDEs, near death experiences, or
Or
high stress,
moments of
high trauma.
crisis. Yeah.
What's that?
Moments of crisis.
Yes, moments of crisis, stress, things like that. So that seems to be in all of this seems to be all falling into line, man. It really seems to be very much so something that it's it's almost as if I think we have all the puzzle pieces, and now we just have to form a coherent narrative of exactly what the Mandela effect is. And we may stumble on in the process help explaining what the ultimate goal is, and that's understanding this reality, because it certainly wasn't what I thought it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And in order to understand reality, we kind of have to understand our environment. And doing so, we basically need to look at physical reality. But we also need to look at non-physical reality. And that's sort of where this kind of document kind of leads us into these altered forms of consciousness where people are leaving their bodies and interacting with other energies.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm of the opinion that it's gone way beyond Focus 15. I'm of the opinion that it's perhaps in a way we've set up bases for because I don't have the vocabulary. We barely are developing a vocabulary for ME, let alone a vocabulary for something like this. But I think that I also have I have a feeling that um, the CIA and all of these other organizations, they want this out. I think they released it obviously because part of what has to happen, for some reason, is everyone has to be taken along with the ride. I think you can have a selective clandestine group go, but so far, but I think there's just a limitation with us as a collective. You go into that Jungian idea of we have this almost spiritual collective this subconscious collective. And it's almost like an Overton window for the spirit in terms of the collective soul of humanity. And in order for there to be a movement forward, that Overton window, or anybody that doesn't know Overton window usually is applied in like like anthropology. And what it is it's what's acceptable behavior, what's acceptable speech. There's a window for anybody that doesn't know, and that's called the Overton window. And the Overton window, if you want to know if it's real or not, think of what was acceptable speech in 1850 versus 1950 versus now. And you can see a radical change in what is acceptable behavior, speech. That's the Overton window. And the Overton window, it drags people along with it. And then there are people who help move that window one way or another, however you want to look at it. But I think that there's something like an Overton window of the human collective. And I think that's also too why astronauts, they have to deal with this like space sickness, and they deal with problems physically once they leave the earth. Because I think, we talk about being grounded. I think it's a literal thing. I think we have to be literally grounded to the earth. I think we need to be in touch with the earth. I don't think we are creatures separate from the earth, regardless of what it is. I don't care what shape you think it is. I don't care about any of those things. After reading this document, all of those arguments to me have faded to a low hum in the background. They're pointless arguments to have, because it's a hologram, but it's our hologram, and I think we have to be in touch with it and take care of it. But I also think that this is illuminating this Overton window of the spirit. And that's the reason why you have to have things like science fiction in order to prep that Overton window, in order to move along the population so they can understand what's happening. Because if you were to not have something like that, and Parsons were to just pull a rocket out of nowhere, and there was absolutely no prep for, and think about the upward movement from 1910 to 1950. I mean, it was unrecognizable. It's almost like what we have now versus the 1970s. It's unrecognizable. It would terrify people, and it would look like a sci-fi either dream or a nightmare, depending on where you're coming from. So, I think that, and I'd like to get your opinion on this, that we all have to be taken along with it in order for this technology to be introduced, and in order for this technology to be integrated, that there almost has to be a poll taken at the subconscious collective soul level, and it has to be a yes or a no in order for it to happen. And what do you think about that?
Personally, I think this is sort of a work in progress. It's not only for people like us on an individual level, but on a collective level. And I think that perhaps information that's just sort of come to light, whether it be, synchronistic information that just sort of comes to you naturally that you weren't actually looking for, or information that was given to you by someone else, really doesn't matter. But the timing seems to be it's kind of the odds of the timing seem to be way too fantastic to be a coincidence. And whenever you get information which you kind of weren't familiar with before, it's good to research it, digest it, and kind of get a really good grasp of what's going on. And it seems to be that this information is kind of opening up a whole new level of understanding, stuff that we weren't familiar with before, but it's got a basic background in a scientific understanding. It's got a basic metaphysic understanding, and it's really giving us a wider view into what is reality. And whether or not we're talking specifically Mandela effect or we're talking consciousness itself, it's giving us this broader view into what actually is actually happening all around us at all times.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. Well said. So do you think I don't know, a lot of people have, and I haven't really gotten into, I know the Monroe Institute is still around. I know that they're still, they still have the classes, and I know about those particular tapes. I know you started the tapes. Have you gotten farther in those tapes?
I've just started the first CD, and I haven't gone too far past the first few to get way too far into it. They even warn in the documents that you shouldn't go ahead too far, and that people have actually experienced what they call a blackout by trying to advance too quickly. So I haven't gotten too far. I've just basically tried to do it every couple of days just to see if I can gain a different form of consciousness, and trying to really do the whole experimentation thing by trying to see what they're talking about.
Well, I noticed too, there was in there where they talked about what it sounded more or less to me is where your spirit could potentially be dislodged from your body, and I know that that's a real concern, and there was a concern enough that it made it into the Department of the Army document. So I think you should, be very cautious in
Yeah,
what
it
you're doing.
says right here. So, hundreds of times we have observed that when an individual begins to stimulate himself more than his level of adjustment will allow, he blanks out the experience. So, you could be listening to one of these tapes, and all of a sudden you might just realize that 10, 15, 20 minutes went by and you don't even remember it happening. That would be like a blank out experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it's much like trauma. If you experience high levels of trauma, you won't remember hours and hours. And that potentially could be what happened is you came across one of these intelligent creatures that may have been walking by in another, hologram and said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And you could have said, "I don't know." And that, I'm just saying, and you could
Yeah.
have ended up, you could have ended up blacking it out because you just weren't ready, man.
Yep. It seems to be like they say it's a process that definitely requires practice and consistency.
Now, do you think I'm wondering too with the way th- we've seemed to have sped up technology. Um, I'm wondering, and I'm trying to think about what the fiction world is telling us now, right now, in terms of, and there's been a lot of that. And I think I drew maybe an incorrect conclusion earlier on. I was thinking that, um, earlier on, I thought that there were artifacts out there. I think there was a movie called like Melancholia, I think it was called, and it was about there being a essentially a Planet X heading towards Earth, and the whole point of the movie was how people were preparing for the end of the world. And at one point, I was thinking about what if, and that was years ago. I think it was like Kirsten Dunst and some other folks in the movie. And it's an incredible movie if anybody hasn't watched it. And I was thinking about what does that really mean? And I still hadn't gotten to this level of forming or understanding what is exactly happening. But I was thinking that perhaps this was a one of those artifacts telling us what had already happened. But indeed, instead of looking back, I should have been looking forward and saying, what is this actually telling us and what does it mean? Now, I'm not exactly saying that, Nibiru is going to be popping up anytime soon and we're going to see two moons or two suns over the horizon, but more or less, it seemed like the entire movie was all about being prepared and being ready for a massive change, and oftentimes, just like with the tarot, death doesn't mean death necessarily. It could mean just a change or whatever. So, and now I'm looking at other movies, and it seems to be a return to remakes are a really big deal right now. A lot of people think it's because of laziness or things like that, but I'm wondering if there's sort of this cycle of repeating, and if we're cycling in a way, because oftentimes whenever you have music or you have whatever it may be, the whole point of it is there to be familiar cycles that go through, and then there you have a beat, you have all of those things, that all of those elements that you have, they're all about repetition in order to kind of get you into that mood, and that's what music does for you. And perhaps at a macro and a micro scale, we could be experiencing that as well. but I'm just trying to figure out now, and I guess maybe I'm not talented enough to try to look forward to see what the fiction realm is trying to tell us, what it holds for the future. Because if I think about the 1970s, which was the late 70s and the early 80s, what was out there, and I'm gonna go and do that as my homework, or maybe people could tell me what was out there at the time in terms of fiction, of science fiction, in terms of movies, because that would have been a really good idea for prepping you for this. Just like the show Stranger Things on Netflix right now. In a lot of ways, that almost, in our small world, even though I don't think we caused it, but it was what's described in this document is almost like what was happening with Montauk, which is ultimately what Stranger Things is about. But and Elle, that character who goes over to this, she was essentially, if you haven't seen it, she clicks out and she brings back. They call it um, the other, or I don't know. I haven't seen the show in a while, but it's basically an alternative version of reality, and it's a much darker version. And she can bring things back, and other things can come back. And there seems to be this tear in this version of reality, but it kind of predates and kind of predicts the coming of this document, at least in my life. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And with all the reruns and the reboots taking place, it could be we're sort of witnessing some kind of cyclical pattern of time and uh, retelling old stories, but in a new way. And kind of the Mandela effect, you can kind of see a little bit of that in there as well, where we have memories of a reality that no longer exists in this dimension, but now we're witnessing another dimension that has a different version of reality. So it's kind of like you see things in a new light. It's still the same thing, but you're seeing it in a new way. Kind of like the same way when you see a reboot, you might have seen the original movie, but when you see the updated movie, you're seeing it in a new way. You're seeing it being presented in a new way.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great thing to think. That's a good way to think about it. Is that MEs, those of us that are MEs, which I assume it's most everybody watching, you have this idea of the hologram, or now we have this idea of this hologram, but we think of ourselves coming from Sagittarius or and then landing in Orion, some of us, and now we can also think about these things maybe not being in such physical terms. They could be more or less a change in vibrational frequencies where we were moved from one side, what may seem like light years away, to the other side, which literally is, a click away, if you pardon the expression. But I really think that I also think about, there's this Quantum of Conscious. Have you watched his channel before?
I've heard of it. I actually haven't seen any of his videos, but the name definitely rings a bell.
Well, it's pretty good. And he has this idea that I enjoy. He talks about this idea of like a micro worlds, where it seems to be you can interface with, you have your own world, but and yet you can still have an interaction with other people, but your world is completely different than other people's worlds. And I'm thinking perhaps part of what we're dealing with in the Mandela effect is that we're starting to communicate better that those differences that we're seeing, but we're also not seeing it just on that micro scale, that we actually are seeing those differences on the macro. So what I see as red is to you blue, but because we can't communicate that, it was that yanny thing, or was the dress blue, or was it like silver? And those kinds of things are starting to bleed through now. And again, I can't help but go back to the idea of there being a strain on resources, because they talk about in this document, this hologram has to be erected like you would a building. There has to be a charge to it in order for it to come to life. Almost like the technology you were showing with there had to have been a charge for that to come to life. Now imagine if within that there's a glitch and it kind of changes for a minute. And everybody remembers that, or some people remember it and some don't. That could be a great metaphor for the Mandela effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing too is within the Mandela effect, it seems like we started at a disadvantage right away because being able to describe things accurately is typically limited by what language we use to describe what's happening. And we really didn't have the language necessary to accurately describe what it was that we were experiencing, what it was that we remember, or how we remembered it. We really didn't have the language. We still don't really have a full vocabulary to accurately explain what it is that's happened to us and still happening to us.
Absolutely. That's a great point. That's a great point to make. Also, too, we're still battling the idea of of a lot of people trying to relegate it to something that is still within the bounds, and that within the bounds of normal society, and that what it is somehow still reimagining the society, but only doing it in like a linguistic fashion, or doing it socially, or trying to keep it within. I don't think that they've read the documents and really have understood now that these documents help MEs in ways that are just, I mean, it would have been a decade's worth of work, and we still wouldn't have had the backbone that we have now. Sort of, that's indicative of a blockchain. Again, we have this document that's just, I don't think people understand how powerful this is for MEs, because it explains so much. And I hope people in the paranormal world, I hope they get a hold of this document. I hope people in the new age, I hope the occult, I hope everybody who is looking for something to help you validate what it is you believe, or augment, or better understand, or at the very least, at least provide you with a broader vocabulary, like you were saying, Buster. It gives you that. That's what this first document and then the subsequent documents, they give us that. Not to mention, to a lot of skeptics, you go argue with the CIA about this hologram. Don't argue with me anymore. Okay? You can beat me up all you like. You can say whatever you want to myself, to Chick, to Buster, to everybody in this live chat that believes it. Your argument is no longer with us. Your argument is with an organization that is using this, and an organization that has the power to take life away. So it has the ultimate power in this plane of existence. So you go and argue with them. I'm not the person you need to argue with.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make. It's not us who originally said that reality is a hologram. We're paraphrasing what they said. They said reality is a hologram, and then they go into detail in explaining why they believe that and use the relevant science to back up their statement.
Absolutely. And I think that, and again, I was so bowled over early on, and it was like, yeah, you know, reality's a hologram. All right, moving on. Anyway, we all know that. Let's get to the real reason why. That's why I'm so curious, and I would love to get to the documents, because obviously it was probably 70s from the timeline that we have here from your research. This is probably pre 70s where they realized reality was a hologram. This could be as early as the 50s or the 40s, or even before that. I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that specifically about the hologram, it's hard to say when exactly they kind of figured it out for themselves, or at least came to that conclusion, because there's really no timeline yet that I've discovered that would suggest exactly when they knew that. We could speculate. Maybe it was early 70s, late 70s, but they seem to be, like you said before, they're talking in the affirmative in that document. Like they've already got that figured out. That's not the purpose of that statement. The purpose of that statement was to show it and then move on to the next form of whatever it was that they were describing so that they could get to their conclusion. It really wasn't the point of stating that reality itself was a hologram. They were just stating it there to support their claim of why the gateway process works.
And I think that's why it was such a pivotal document, and why I belabored it for so long, because I wanted so much to work into the um the subconscious and the lexicon of the Mandela Effect community. And I so wanted to spread to, I really want other communities, because it will help them out. And I really would love for people, if you're an occultist, if you're into the paranormal, if you're into those kinds of things, please read it and spread it around because it helps you. It truly does. It will really help out quite a bit. And and what it does is you'll be able to subvert the argument. You'll be able to subvert the argument from you having to make these statements and prove them to a skeptic to saying, fine, if traditional skeptics, they always want to cite a passage from a study, or they want to cite a passage from an article, or from something from a university. What can be more official than the government itself? And then I would dare say, in terms of people bailing out immediately and going, "Oh, it's disinformation." I still don't get that feeling because that's not the purpose of this document. And it's 30-year-old technology. If they were trying to get to this technology 30 years ago, I'm sure they are so far beyond it. They could be where Joe Rogan and Alex Jones were talking about, and they're like making, treatise with like, electric elves or whatever it is they were calling the machine elves or whatever it is. They could be well beyond this, where there are entire civilizations and other holograms that they're dealing with at this point. And we could be, and I know that's wild speculation, but we're talking to me anyway, so whatever. But that's what I'm thinking,
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally. All right. Well, we're just over at the hour. I like to keep it around there. That way, folks would want to look at it later and it's not too long. Because I know for me, it has to be something major, like, that Joe Rogan thing where if I see a 3 hour, it better be worth it for my 3 hours for me to jump on. Is there anything else? And we're going to have a roundtable. I spoke to Chick and she's down with it. And I sent her over the documents as well. I'd like to do that next week if you're okay with it. Get all three of us, because her perspective sometimes is like something I don't even consider. So maybe we could do it on the fly and do it on a show like this in this kind of format, and all three of us kind of powwow. And then I'll go back and look at the live chat, everybody. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And, I do take into consideration especially with the regulars, what you say, and I do pay attention to it. And I want to thank everybody for being here. And if you're okay with that, Buster, maybe next week all three of us can get together, and by then I'll have probably different opinions and deeper, more complex opinions. And are you cool with that?
Sure, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. I see a lot of people who come back over and over again, and I don't want to leave anybody out. So all of you that come back over and over again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Please hit that like button. I see there are 94 people watching. I would love to see 93 people. I would love to see 93 thumbs up if you could. It would really help out. And just thank you so much. And I think we're really making really good headway for the ME community. And I hope that eventually we can expand this into other communities and we can help them, and they can read documents like this, and they too can, divert that argument so they can use their energies and resources, rather than defending their position, to expanding their position and making more articulate positions. Because of what we have right here, our position now is so much more articulate than it was before we had these documents, and our understanding is so much more articulate that we have moved a decade beyond. So again, Buster, thank you so much for everything you've done for the community and for my channel in particular.
Oh, you're
And
welcome.
yes, and that's it, everybody. We're jumping off. All right, stay on here.